what I'm wanting to talk about today is World Heritage Sites. Now, I think everybody will have heard of World Heritage Sites, and most people will have visited a World Heritage Site. Let me just check this. But in fact, one of the interesting things to me is that we often visit World Heritage Sites without realizing that we're in a World Heritage Site. And even for people who do know that it's a World Heritage Site, or who have chosen to visit that particular place specifically to look at a World Heritage Site, so I think there's still quite a lot of people, or we don't necessarily know what is a World Heritage Site. How does a place become a World Heritage Site? What does being a World Heritage Site involve? And so I thought it would be quite nice just to run through that sort of thing, to give a little bit more background about World Heritage Sites. Now, one of the interesting things to me, in fact, is this business of how do places signal that they're a World Heritage Site. There's a very clear World Heritage symbol, and you can see it on the background slide there. It's the square within the circle, and it's a very strong and a very ancient symbol that symbolizes the mixture of cultural and natural people, symbolized by the square within their place in the world, if you like. And many different cultures have used this site. And some World Heritage Sites really pick up on it and have plenty of signage. One of the best places that I've ever visited for that is, in fact, Quebec City, Old Quebec in Canada, where as you move around the city, there's plenty of reminders that you're in a World Heritage Site, from standard signage to hoardings to painting, as you can see there on the street and on concrete blocks. And if I can go back, yes, at the centre of Quebec City, you've got this wonderful sculpture, which again symbolises the World Heritage Site. So there's no doubt, if you're in Quebec City, that you're in a World Heritage Site. But actually, there are World Heritage Sites where you wouldn't know you were in a World Heritage Site. And I think that's a great shame, because World Heritage is something to be celebrated. It takes quite a lot of effort to become a World Heritage Site. And once you're part of a World Heritage Site, it takes quite a lot of effort to maintain it. So I do think it's something that is worth telling people about. Now, there are World Heritage Sites all around the world, and very often they're in iconic tourist locations. I think sometimes we'd be quite surprised at the remote locations, or indeed sometimes you might feel that you can't go on holiday without tripping over World Heritage Sites. And what you'll find is, if you look, for example, at many of the cruise ship itineraries around the world, they do go from World Heritage Site to World Heritage Site. So World Heritage Sites are definitely something that are flagged up as attracting people. It's seen as something that gives value, that makes somewhere something that you should want to visit. But it's not just about visiting, it's about so much more than that. What is the World Heritage Convention? Well, the World Heritage Convention is what is behind the making of World Heritage Site. It's a global convention. It was adopted by UNESCO in 1972. It's not mandatory to sign up to it, so there are countries that haven't signed up to it that don't have World Heritage Sites, but to date it's been signed by 193 countries. And so this is what makes the idea of World Heritage truly global. It is something that extends around the world. And the idea behind World Heritage Site is that it picks out, it recognizes sites that are truly exceptional in global terms. Now, that's obviously very woolly and it's very carefully defined. If you're going to have a World Heritage Site in your nation state, then you have to be able to justify why it merits. You have to produce a statement called a Statement of Outstanding Universal Value that sets out exactly why that particular site merits it, why it is of global significance. And what the World Heritage Convention seeks to do is to safeguard the well-being of these sites so that as we move forward into the future, and obviously the future is something that none of us can predict, we're actually still going to have these sites which provide information, provide an idea, not only about the human past as it's developed around the globe, but also about the natural world. So World Heritage Sites are not just archaeological or cultural, they are natural as well. And I should say that in recent years, there's also been a move to recognizing the fact that World Heritage is not always tangible. It's not always something that you can see or visit. World Heritage can be intangible, and so it can be things like music or language, or even certain foods and ways of cooking. World Heritage is what makes us as a people at any one time, or what makes a place as a place at any one time. So although in this lecture, because I'm using visual slides, I'm very much talking about tangible world heritage, it's important to remember that there is also an intangible world heritage. Now, obviously, in order to define a World Heritage Site, to move along this path, we have to know what we mean by heritage. And certainly in terms of cultural heritage, we're thinking, well, heritage, it's defined by the convention as the legacy from the past. What we live with today, so those remains of the past that are around us that tell us about our human past. And they are indeed the remains that we wish to pass on to future generations. So as with anything that has a legal side, there are quite carefully defined, tight verbalizations of what is meant by World Heritage. World Heritage can be very obvious. There are some sites like Stonehenge there, or these timber churches in Chile, that you might say, well, it's fairly obvious to everyone that these should be World Heritage Sites. Perhaps nobody would disagree that these sites are of exceptional value. Sometimes, though, it can challenge us a little bit more. World Heritage can be less obvious, it can be surprising. So there are indeed some industrialized landscapes. Here, for example, in a mining landscape, which has been recognized as of World Heritage significance. And of course, it's important because our past isn't just some sort of bucolic, agricultural or romantic past. Our past is also about developments in technology and industrialization. These are all the things that have brought us to what we are today. And here another technological World Heritage Site, if you like, the Forth Rail Bridge in Scotland. And occasionally, or as with any of these World Heritage Sites, it's also important to remember that the designation of World Heritage Site can be geographically quite tight. In this case, it's the bridge itself. But it is the context of these sites, it is the landscape in which they sit, which also gives them meaning. And of course, here with the Forth Rail Bridge, you've got now the context of the three crossings, with the new Queensferry Crossing Bridge, the old Forth Road Bridge, and then the rail bridge itself, very much placed side by side in what is, I think, now an iconic gateway to Scotland landscape. Although it has to be noticed that if you arrive in Edinburgh, you can go north and south. There is as much, or there is Scotland extends to the south as well as the north. So it's not just about coming up to the Highlands. But how do you become a World Heritage Site? Well, a nation state will produce a series of documents in which they nominate sites. And even the production of those documents can be a lengthy process. Sites can be the original suggestion, might come from a local community, or it might come from a nation state heritage organization. It might come from a local government perspective. So there's a lot of different ways in which, if you like, the original seed can be sown, but the actual nomination documents put together by the nation state, they then go to UNESCO through a body called ICOMOS, the International Committee on Monuments and Sites. That's for the cultural sites. And an international committee will examine the documents, visit the site. They're not just interested, in fact, on the significance of the site. They're also interested in aspects like the condition of the site, can the site be looked after into the future, that sort of thing. So this process can take several years. And there is a tentative list of World Heritage Sites, which are sites where the nomination has gone forward, but the sites haven't yet been put onto the World Heritage list. So becoming a World Heritage Site is a long, involved and slow process, as you might guess for something of global significance. There are hurdles to overcome, and it's not an easy process. There are many, many conditions in this. So essentially, as I was saying, the state has to have a plan for the future. It's not just about saying, oh, we've got these ruins and they're really great. The state has to be able to say how they're going to move forward, how they're going to look after them without the site itself becoming damaged. And of course, becoming a World Heritage Site can add to the pressures on a location. So all of this is something that has to be taken into account. To date, there are just over 1,121 World Heritage Sites around the world, and they exist in 167 countries. So from that, you can see that there are countries which have signed up to the convention, but where World Heritage Sites still have to be ratified. But it is, nevertheless, a global construct. World Heritage Sites do exist around the world. Once a site has been placed on the list of World Heritage Sites, it's not over. In fact, then the management of the site, there's a ramping up, if you like, of bureaucracy. Often lots of committees are created to look at things like management, interpretation, access. Can visitors access the site? How are visitors controlled going through the site? How do you how do you move forward to ensure that the site is not going to be damaged if you have increased visitors? You might also be looking at how are you going to learn more about the site? Is research going to be ongoing? One of the common misconceptions with a World Heritage Site is that it brings money. In actual fact, the designation doesn't bring any increased money. There's no sort of pot of World Heritage funding. But of course, if you're interested in doing research on a location, or if you're trying to improve interpretation, then saying that that particular location is a World Heritage Site does increase the value. It increases the impetus for you to do the work and for money to be given. So it's definitely a kind of brownie point, if you like, but one that has to be used very carefully. You can see here, in fact, I think a number of people going through what is, in essence, quite a fragile World Heritage Site. And as you might guess, because sites are monitored and the monitoring comes down from the top, from the international level, as well as the local level, there is a list of endangered sites. And at the moment, 53 sites sit on the endangered list. Just occasionally, sites will be removed from the World Heritage List. It doesn't happen very often. I think there's only 2 or 3 sites. But if a site is deemed to be damaged strongly enough, then it may be removed. More to the point, when a site goes onto the endangered list, it's a kind of wake-up call for the local management that maybe action needs to be taken, or maybe they should think about development. Sites can be placed on the endangered list for many reasons. There's kind of obvious reasons of war, disruption and degradation. But other reasons, for example, can be inappropriate development. So if you have a site where, for example, the skyline might be broken, and that skyline is deemed to be essential to the nature of the site, then questions might be asked about the future of the designation. So the endangered list is always quite an interesting one to have a look at. Sites don't just sit in individual countries. There are 39 sites which actually straddle national boundaries. For example, Misiones here, which runs between Argentina and Brazil. So the site actually crosses the boundary. And there are also sites where different elements of the World Heritage Site might sit in different nations. So you've got the Frontiers of the Roman Empire World Heritage Site, which has elements in Germany and elements in the United Kingdom. Not always an easy business when you're talking about management and things. And as I said at the beginning, obviously, because I'm an archaeologist, I'm afraid my knowledge and focus does tend to drift towards the cultural, but World Heritage is very, very much about natural sites as well as cultural sites. It's not just something that's looking at human creations, it's also looking at iconic and significant natural locations around the globe. And so we have both cultural sites and natural sites. Cultural sites, generally summed up as masterpieces of human creative genius. So cultural sites incorporating something that is built or created, changed from its natural state in some way. Natural sites, superlative natural phenomena, or areas of exceptional natural beauty. And it's interesting, again, to look at the list, to look at the different sites that have merited the natural designation. A few sites, a very few sites, and in some ways this incorporates double the bureaucracy. A few sites are both cultural and natural, and we're very lucky here in Scotland because we've got one of them, which is St Kilda, and I'll be talking a little bit more about St Kilda in a bit, but St Kilda is one of the rare sites that is designated for both cultural and natural reasons. Now, the United Kingdom, in the whole of the United Kingdom, we've got 32 World Heritage Sites, and 5 of them are in Scotland. So I thought it's quite nice just to run through our Scottish sites. And of course, the one that is most close to my heart, perhaps, not only because I live here, but I'm interested in the culture behind it, is the site known as the Heart of Neolithic Orkney. And here the site is made up, in fact, of different elements. I've got photographs of the main elements. There's also 1 or 2 much smaller elements. These are, if you like, individual dots on the map, but very much that was a sort of management bureaucratic proposal. They're joined together by a whole landscape. And so you've got the standing stones of Stennis, the Ring of Brodgar, Maeshowe, the great Neolithic burial tomb, and in that photograph you can just see the World Heritage sign at the foot of the photograph. inscribed in stone there, and the site at Scarabray. So in fact, what's really nice about the heart of Neolithic Orkney is that you've got life, you've got sort of houses that you would have lived in if you'd been an average Orcadian or Neolithic farmer 5,000 years ago. You've got the burial sites. Perhaps Maysow wasn't so much for the average person, perhaps for the above, but you've got burial site and you've got the ceremonial sites. You've got the standing stones of Stennis and the Ring of Brodgar. Of course, you might say, if you're familiar with Orcadian archaeology, well, it's interesting that the Ness of Brodgar, which is a very significant Neolithic ceremonial site that lies, in fact, between the Ring of Brodgar and the standing stones of Stennis, Ness isn't a World Heritage Site. And there are various reasons for that. Perhaps the most obvious being that Ness was discovered after the World Heritage designation was made. And it's quite a lot of work to alter a World Heritage designation. Equally, I think it would be fair to say that we're still finding out about Ness. So there are a lot of things to think about regarding the Ness of Brodgar. And indeed, it's by no means certain whether Ness will be laid out for people to visit as it is here, or what the future of Ness will be. All these things would still have to be resolved before there could be consideration of bringing Ness into the World Heritage folder for the heart of Neolithic Orkney. But equally, it has to be said that a site of that significance clearly merits thought and attention. So World Heritage, sometimes the sort of obvious things aren't involved, and we have to think about the reasons for that. Other sites, as I've said, the Forth Rail Bridge here, built in 1888, and in fact our most recent World Heritage Site, very much one about technology, and another one about perhaps mixing technology and also idealism and things, and one where I think it shows us how our thoughts and our ways of life change very much, is the site at New Lanark. Now, New Lanark is a mill town. It started in the late 18th century and then was very much created as a utopian community in the early 19th century. I think it has to be said that the definition of utopian that was in operation then isn't necessarily one that we would use today, and the conditions and life and things that went on there when it was at its height in the 19th century aren't necessarily things that we would wish to accept today, but they're an important part of the way in which we have become what we are today. And so it's very important to celebrate these and examine these. And what New Lanark does is it challenges us. We can go there, we can go and visit the site, we can look at the mills, we can look at the accommodation, we can look at the lifestyles, and it makes us think both about the past and the present, and hopefully it makes us think about the future that we'd like to move into. So you have these great water-powered mills lying at the heart of Scotland, at the heart of southern Scotland in its time, really very much facilitated by the role of water as a major source of power. And the housing on bottom picture shows, it all went together as a package. So if you worked in New Lanark, you got housing, education, company stores and everything, all provided by the mill owners. And you can see that there's still, even though it is a utopian community, there's an acceptance of a certain amount of stratification in utopia. So the lower slide shows the blocks of apartments for the workers, and the upper slide, you've got higher up in the hierarchy, accommodation, and obviously the church behind, all an important part of life in New Lanark at the time. And a fantastic architectural achievement as well, I think it has to be said. Well worth visiting if you haven't been there. And then on to St Kilda, our most remote World Heritage Site, and one which most people won't be fortunate enough to visit in person. Involves a certain amount of difficulty in getting there. You've either got probably 2 days of seasickness on a small yacht, which was how I got there, or you've got a very scary helicopter journey if you can blag a ride on one of the official helicopters. But again, a site that's very much tied up with our past. And as I was saying in this case, not just about our cultural past, but also our natural world as well. And it's quite surprising when you do go to St Kilda in some ways. There are always a handful of tourists there. There's a small army presence there. There's always dive boats and tourists and things out in the bay. But generally a very remote site lying off the west coast of Scotland. I realise I haven't got a map showing the location of any of these sites, but that can be your homework for afterwards. You have to go and Google all the sites, see where they are. And in fact, if you want to visit St Kilda, there's a great virtual worlds exhibition about St Kilda made by the people at the Virtual Past. And I've put the link on the screen here. It's not a live link, but you can copy it. And I would recommend looking at their reconstructions, both of individual buildings and of the St Kilda landscape. It's a great way to visit it and learn more about it, together with the St Kilda website. Another of our World Heritage sites, this time much easier to visit, lies in the city of Edinburgh, the old and new towns of the city of Edinburgh. And very much contrasting here the medieval city, which you can see on these photographs, still retaining many of these beautiful old, very early skyscrapers, in fact, some 6 or 7 stories high. And then the new town, the 18th century designed landscape as the population expanded and wealth increased and people wanted housing out with the crowded heart of the city. And so you've got this beautiful designed landscape. And our final World Heritage Site is the Antonine Wall, the Roman wall built of turf and earth, which runs from the Forth to the Clyde. Not perhaps as well known as its southern neighbour, Hadrian's Wall, which is also a World Heritage Site. But in fact, there are many, many sites you can visit. It's impressive to realise how much of the Antonine Wall survives. A really interesting World Heritage Site here, and one which is part of the Frontiers of the Roman Empire World Heritage Site, as I was saying. So there are elements, World Heritage elements, in both the UK and Germany, and you can see here, in fact, the whole of the frontiers set out running round the Roman Empire in its entirety. And here, one of the sites, the site at Rough Castle, one of the easiest sites to visit of the Antonine Wall, and a really nice place to explore. Now, in addition, in Scotland, we've actually got 2 sites currently on the tentative list. And the first of these, a really exciting location, is in Shetland. And this would be a World Heritage Site to be known as the Zenith of Iron Age Shetland. And it includes 3 elements. It includes the Iron Age sites at Moosa, at Old Scatness, and at Jarlshof. And this site, in a way, should be a no-brainer, because actually, if you look at the United Kingdom, there are no Iron Age World Heritage Sites. So if you look at the World Heritage Sites of the United Kingdom, in fact, that Neolithic's fairly well represented. And in fact, if you look at World Heritage in general, Neolithic's very well represented. Iron Age less so, in fact. So it would be really nice to see this site going forward as a World Heritage Site. Perhaps some of the issues of management and maintenance and future well-being slightly more complex here. It's in a very difficult environment. All sorts of things like that need to be taken into account. But I really hope that we're going to see Iron Age Shetland moving onto the World Heritage List before too long. And another site, our other tentative site, again in a very fragile environment, but for that reason, perhaps all the more important, all the more significant, and all the more important to get it onto the World Heritage List is the Flow Country, this amazing landscape in northern Scotland, up in Caithness. After the mountains of the Highlands have stopped, you've got these peatlands sitting high up above the sea, where land and water just blur into one another. Again, there's nice visitor centre sites where you can go and experience it and learn about it. This, of course, would be a natural site, but it has had a really important impact on the way people have lived in the area as well. So again, it would be nice to see this moving forward into being designated as a World Heritage Site. Now, I thought just to end with a few more slides, what I wanted to do was to look at just, okay, it's fine, we can talk about what a World Heritage Site is, we can show lots of pretty pictures about World Heritage sites and things, but what is it like to live with a World Heritage Site? What is it like today to be a part of a World Heritage Site? And of course, here in Orkney, we can examine some of these issues. And so just one or two things. Well, to start with, of course, World Heritage is an accolade. So living with a World Heritage Site is exciting. And there's no doubt that even though, in fact, the designation can make it quite difficult to do research on the site itself because of issues of future management and well-being and things, it is a spur to research on sites that are close to the heart of it. And so here you've got the excavations at Nesselbrogga, right sort of nestled into the heart of Neolithic Orkney, although not part of the designation itself. Having said that, it can also be a difficult one because you want to learn more about that World Heritage landscape, it can make it more difficult to find out or to undertake research on sites that are just a little bit further away. So while you've got great sort of excavations and things going on at the heart of the World Heritage Site, if you move maybe 25, 30 miles away, does the ability to do archaeological research drop off as you get further away? And these are all things that have to be taken into account in research designs, looking for research funding, that sort of thing. But definitely it brings a sort of buzz to archaeological work, if you like, around the World Heritage Site and general research. Having said that, it can also bring people, and there's no doubt that although many people come to Orkney for the archaeology, there are a number of people who come particularly because a site is a World Heritage Site. And of course, having got to Orkney, everybody wants to visit the World Heritage Sites. Sites can get overcrowded. Now, it's important to remember that the attraction of these sites are World Heritage Sites because they're recognised as significance. And that significance doesn't just come out of the blue. That significance has been there for a long time. So you do have sites like Skara Brace, shown here in the 1950s, that have long been subject to tourist pressures. But I think, as you can imagine from seeing the picture here, that trying to visit a site with this number of people on it doesn't always give you the best tourist experience, the best viewing experience, and it's definitely not good for the site. So once a site becomes a World Heritage Site, you do have to think carefully about that visitor experience. and maybe think about how you can both manage it when people do visit the site and also perhaps even reduce footfall by encouraging people to go out to other equally interesting sites in the vicinity. But that can be quite a complex process. And of course, it becomes particularly complex when you have visitors arriving in large numbers, and there's nothing that brings in a large number of visitors more at any one time than the arrival of a large cruise ship. And so definitely these examples of visitors kind of coming, whether they're coming as a bus trip that brings 40 people at a time, or as a cruise ship that can bring several thousand, needs to be managed very carefully. Having said that, it's also important to remember that this arrival of visitors, the impact of cruise ships, it has increased tourism. It has a definite economic benefit to a location. And of course, that's something that we're seeing very much in our present situation, where tourism has, for the moment, been halted. And I think everybody's suddenly become aware of the economic value of tourism that would normally be there, that we're all having to live without. So World Heritage Sites, by bringing increased awareness, by giving increased impetus, they do bring, help to bring a positive economic impact on a place. And you can argue that really, this is just about issues of scale. And so perhaps it's not to say that tourism, that increased visitors' numbers are a bad thing per se, but more that we need to look carefully at how we manage them. We need to look at the numbers of people arriving. And so here you've got a much smaller cruise ship taking about a quarter of the people on the last ship in a small community in Greenland. And it is very much about thinking about these issues, about numbers, about ways, what activities can people do when they arrive. These issues of scale are something that I think we still have to get to grips with in the way in which we're managing tourism and its impact on World Heritage Sites, both locally and globally. And there are negative sides to living with a World Heritage Site. It definitely brings increased bureaucracy. So I think many of the people who live in and around the World Heritage Site in Orkney, particularly people who are wanting to develop landscapes, perhaps put up wind turbines, increase farm buildings, that sort of thing, it becomes impossible to do anything without filling in forms. Of course, that doesn't mean that development isn't permitted. It just means that it can be a longer and slower process. You have to think twice. That's maybe no bad thing, but it's not always all kind of roses, if you like. There can be a negative side to living with a World Heritage Site. It also, negative or not, but it definitely brings increased publicity. You live much more in the public eye, whether that's increased numbers of visitors around the site, whether it's increased increased attention from television programs. There's every summer, most summers, I think this summer will be one of the few, but we have television crews here in Orkney, we have film crews. You can't visit a site sometimes without being filmed in the background or being asked to step aside, this sort of thing. You very, very much live in the public eye. So living with or in and around a World Heritage Site, I think people who've experienced any site, Edinburgh, New Lanark, any of our United Kingdom sites, Stonehenge, it's very much something that you think about very carefully. It does affect the daily life of those who live in and around them. And of course, there's an increased responsibility as we look after the sites. But overall, I think it has to be said, okay, what's it like to live with a World Heritage Site? Well, generally, it's a privilege because we are living somewhere that other people aspire to visit. And sometimes you're driving around, you kind of forget that, but sometimes you'll catch a glimpse of a view or a landscape, or you'll go to the sites with people who haven't been here before, and you're reminded just how lucky you are to live in this sort of place. But equally, I think in order to really understand that, you have to be able to understand the kind of global background of why a place is a World Heritage Site and what's involved. Thanks very much.